Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for this webinar on census and data. As you know, Asian Americans Advancing Justice is working to ensure a full and accurate count of our communities in the 2020 census. As a national hub, we're working to develop curriculum and materials to support your Get Out the Count work, including fact sheets, toolkits, webinars, social media graphics, translated materials, and more. Today, we're excited to dive deeper into confidentiality protections, how census data are used, and data security. As you may know, this webinar is the 12th installment of our monthly census webinar series, which we launched in August 2018. If you missed our previous webinars and want to tune in, you can access them with the links on this slide. Our next webinar is taking place next month in October. Check out our census website at www.countusin2020.org for all of our webinars and accompanying summary blogs. The website also hosts our toolkit, fact sheets, partner resources, and more. Check back later this month for new translated Get Out the Count fact sheets. Without further ado, I want to turn it over to our speakers. Julia Marks is a staff attorney with the Voting Rights and Census program at Asian Americans Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus. Before joining Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus, she clerked for the Honorable Keith P. Ellison of the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Texas. Julia previously litigated civil rights class actions and other high-impact cases at disability rights advocates to expand access to public and private sector services. Maria Filippelli is a public interest technology census fellow at New America. She has a background in urban planning, civic technology, and data science. Previously, Maria worked at DataKind, an organization that harnesses the power of data science in the service of humanity. She worked as a data science manager with a project portfolio largely focused on democratic freedoms and civil liberties. We welcome Julia and Maria to today's webinar and are excited to hear from them. We will have Q&A at the end of the webinar, and you can use the chat box or questions box to send your questions, or raise your hand to have your line unmuted so you can ask the question yourself. If you have questions during the presentation, please also use the chat box or questions box to send us your questions. And I'll repeat these instructions once we get to Q&A at the end. This webinar is recorded, and we will send out the recording and presentation after the webinar. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Julia.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here to find out more about Census 2020 confidentiality and how the confidential data will be used. So I just want to give a little background on my role at Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus. I'm a staff attorney on our Voting Rights and Census team. And we understand, like all those of you on the call, that census participation is essential to a fair and inclusive and functioning democracy, as well as essential to the health of our communities and their access to all the resources that they're entitled to as our fellow Americans. And so we are having conversations with folks about how to message not only the importance of census, but also the safety of census participation. So my talk today will focus on the confidentiality laws that protect census responses so that you all are fully informed in your conversations with your communities and can explain why it's safe to participate in the census. And then I'll talk a little bit about what the data is used for. We talk a lot about fears about data use, but it's also important to be able to say the benefits of providing this information to the government. So without further ado, we'll begin with Title 13. Here's just a roadmap of our talk. Next slide. Okay, so the Census Bureau has documented very high rates of concern about how the federal government will be using folks' census responses. So there are a couple ways folks have expressed concerns, and the rates of concerns are alarmingly high. So you'll see when the Bureau asked people whether they were concerned that their answers would not be kept confidential, very high percentages of people said they were either extremely concerned or very concerned that their data would not be confidential. So for example, we see among Asian respondents, 42% had heightened levels of concern. Next slide. not only were people concerned that their information would not be kept confidential, they were also concerned that their census responses would actually be used against them. So again, 41% of Asian respondents said they were extremely concerned or very concerned. You can see for other groups, 35% of Black respondents had extreme or high levels of concern, and 32% of Hispanic respondents reported similarly. So these are large issues, and I assume you are hearing them in your day-to-day conversations as you plan for Get Out the Count. Next slide. But fortunately, we have very strong confidentiality laws in place. So Title 13 is a federal statute that has been in place for decades, and it has very clear limitations on the sharing of census data and the sharing of the individual responses that folks are going to give to the Census Bureau. So individual responses cannot be shared with the public, with other federal government agencies, with state or local governments. They cannot be shared with anyone outside of the Census Bureau. The Title 13 also specifies that individual responses can't be accessed through any kind of legal process. They can't be used as evidence against people in legal proceedings or administrative proceedings or immigration proceedings. So there are strong protections for individual records. Next slide. Additionally, Title 13 makes clear that data cannot be used for anything other than statistical analysis. So this gets at the concerns that not only will information be shared, but that it'll be used against people. The law makes clear that the Census Bureau can only collect this information for statistical uses, and it can only be used for statistical uses. It also specifies that data cannot be used to the detriment of respondents. And it's important to note that this prohibition applies not just to the individual response provided by a person, but also applies to all the statistics that the Bureau assembles based on the responses it collects. Next, yeah. So Title 13 has very harsh consequences for people who violate any of these rules about census confidentiality and the proper use of census data. If a Census Bureau employee, a temporary employee, a permanent employee, anyone working with the Bureau on census, if they wrongfully disclose a person's census response or individual information, then they can be subject to a $250,000 fine or up to 5 years in prison or both. And it's also worth noting that Title 13 is a federal statute. It cannot just be changed unilaterally by the Trump administration. I know right now when we say, oh, this is the legal requirement, that's not always something that's particularly trustworthy for folks, but federal statutes are not something that can be changed through an executive order. It would take both the House and the Senate to change Title 13. And Title 13 has been in place for decades and has a long history of being respected and taken very seriously by the Census Bureau. Next slide. Also, Title 13 applies broadly. It applies to the decennial census, which is what we're talking about now as we gear up for March 2020. But it also applies to all the other information that the Census Bureau is gathering through its tests and other surveys. As many of you probably know, in addition to the decennial census, the Bureau sends out the American Communities Survey, which asks for much more detailed information. So the collected data through ACS as well as the decennial census has to be kept confidential, cannot be used against respondents. All of that still applies. Additionally, Title 13 means that when the Bureau is releasing data out, even if it's not specifically linked to someone's name, which would be illegal, they take extra steps to make sure that the statistical data set can't be traced back to anyone. So with modern computing, there are ways that folks can dig through large data sets to try to figure out details on specific respondents, not linked to a name, but just through statistical tools. And the Bureau, to comply with Title 13, goes above and beyond to manipulate the data to ensure there's an extra level of privacy. Basically, they're adding noise to the data sets they release to make sure that there's no way for anyone to trace back from the statistics to a specific individual. Next. I want to pause for a second in case those of you who've been tracking census are probably aware of the Trump administration's attempted addition of the citizenship question. As we all know, there will not be a question about citizenship on the 2020 census. But the administration did announce that they will be trying to assemble citizenship information and link that information to respondents for the census. So when the census is taken, it won't ask about citizenship, but when the final data is assembled to share out publicly, those data sets will have citizenship information. So it's very important, if folks know about this, that they also know that the confidentiality laws still apply. We don't want talk about these citizenship variables in the data sets to create heightened levels of fear. It is not like the federal government is not going to ask people about citizenship, and they also are not going to be able to gather and share information. Any information that comes into the Bureau, that's a one-way information exchange. It cannot be shared out. So if folks have concerns about that, you can tell them that that information is safe as well. We also have some more detailed written information on this issue, and I'm happy to share that out with folks after the webinar. Next. Great. So some folks also have raised concerns that even if you can't trace data to an individual person, that the broad anonymized data sets could somehow be used against specific communities or groups of people. So I wanted to take a moment to talk about some of the procedural protections that are in place that help make sure that statistical data sets that the Bureau is releasing are not going to be used against people as Title 13 requires. So the Census Bureau is allowed to, and does, in fact, the point is to provide sets of data that are anonymized where you can't trace it back to a specific person to the general public for a range of purposes, which we'll get into. And in addition to doing that, folks in the public, in business, in government can request custom tabulations and sets of specific statistics to use in a range of research and policy making. And so the Bureau has put some protections in place. Again, the data sets cannot violate the confidentiality of an individual respondent, and they also can't release data sets that would interfere with the Census Bureau's goals, objectives, and mission. Next. To make sure that agencies and businesses and the public are using these data sets and requests properly, there are some procedural protections. So all special requests for a special tabulation of data have to be publicly disclosed. And there's a whole list of sensitive topics, including religion and race and ethnicity, that have to be reviewed by the Policy Coordination Office. So if there's a request that people are worried will violate the purpose of the census and have negative policy implications, it gets reviewed in addition to having to be publicized with all the other requests that go out there. Okay, next slide. Okay, so all these statistics are being shared out with the world. And why do we do that? Why is this useful and important? So there are a few big categories of use of census data. One we've talked a lot about, and we'll talk about a bit more today, is federal funding. In addition to that, though, it's used for reapportionment and redistricting. It's used for civil rights enforcement, including voting rights enforcement. And then more generally, it's used for research and policy making and planning purposes. And businesses and the private sector use census data, for example, to figure out where they want to expand, where they want to open new stores or try to hire more workforce. So there's a whole range of ways this data is used. And as we're messaging to our communities about why they might want to participate, it's helpful to keep this full list in mind. I was in a conversation recently with some folks doing college campus outreach, and they said, to be honest, no one on this campus cares about federal funding. They just want to find a job. So that's where it's helpful to remember that there are the, business purposes as well as the topics we talk about most frequently, like funding and reapportionment. Next slide. Okay, so federal funding is a big motivator because so much money is going out to states and localities based on the census results. So more than 300 federal programs are guided by census data, and they distribute more than $900 billion per year. These aren't all direct distributions. Some of them are direct payments out to individuals. Some of them are grants to local governments. Some of them are loans and loan guarantees. The census data also affect tax credit programs and federal contracting. I do want to pause and give a lot of credit to Andrew Reamer at the GW Institute of Public Policy, who's done a tremendous amount of research on how all these programs use census data and ACS data. And I would highly recommend, if you want to find out more, going to that website. You can find out a lot of detail state by state, too, on how the funding is distributed. Next slide. Great. So the decennial census data doesn't always affect funding in a simple way. It's not like, okay, if we count more people here, we'll automatically get X number of dollars more next time around. But the data is used for a whole range of important calculations that go into how the funding is distributed. So one example of that is that census data determines geographic classifications of different areas. So the population density being determined by population count, will determine which programs might apply in which parts of the country, or will affect how certain rates of calculation regarding more specific more specific programs, and so they'll look at per capita income, but only in rural areas or only certain types of areas. So geographic classifications apply there. Population estimates, again, will change per capita income, which is often used in determining how programs get funded and where they get funded. Housing estimates and other program-specific calculations like median income, but by area. So none of these are a one-to-one change of each count doesn't equal a certain amount of money. It's a little more complicated. Another example of that is the FMAP, which is the Federal Medical Assistance Percentage. So that again uses per capita income. So the population count matters, but it's a little more complicated to figure out how it will affect each state's total funding package. Okay, next. Okay, so I just listed out some of the biggest programs that are affected by census data. Medicaid and Medicare, those are affected by FMAP, which is what I just mentioned, that looks at income, federal direct student loans and Pell Grants, SNAP, highway planning and construction programs, Section 8 housing vouchers, temporary assistance for needy families. Next. Low-income housing loans, Title I grants to LEAs, state children's health insurance program, national school lunch program, and special education grants. And then there are dozens and dozens of more programs, but these are just the largest ones nationwide. Next. Okay. In addition to funding, there's the big issue of how we are represented in our government. So the first thing that will happen using the census data is that the federal government will reapportion the number of congressional seats in each state. So this also affects the Electoral College. So in December of 2020, the population counts will be released and they will recalculate the number of seats for each state, and a number of states are likely to either gain or lose seats in the upcoming cycle. Folks predict that Florida and Texas will have the biggest seat gains, but differential undercounts could affect that. And then after that happens, states across the country will start redrawing all of their maps. And so for that, the Census Bureau releases a redistricting data file, and that includes information on population counts, race and ethnicity, the number of people who are voting age, all of that at a very small level so that maps can be drawn. And then in addition to that, voting rights enforcement relies on census data from the decennial census and from the American Community Survey. And so we use that data to make sure that people have the opportunity to elect candidates of their choice and to make sure that districts are fairly drawn. We also use it to make sure that language access laws and requirements are being complied with. So in certain areas with large communities of limited English proficient voters, there's a requirement to provide translated ballots. And all of that can only be enforced if we have accurate census data. So I'm going to turn it over to Maria from New America to talk more about cybersecurity. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Julia, for that. And thanks, folks, for joining the webinar today. So as mentioned in the intro, my name is Maria Filippelli. I'm a public interest technology census fellow with New America. And I work closely with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights and their Census Counts campaign on a lot of the new and emerging issues that we're seeing in 2020. So things like, what does it mean to actually release a nationwide self-response portal, and is it really secure? And now that we live in this world of disinformation, like, what does that mean? And so I work on a lot of those issues, and I'll talk through some of them today. And so a lot of my presentation will kind of build on what Julia talked about early in her presentation, because she talked a lot about legal protections and the legal protections around data sharing and data procedures. And so I'm going to walk through a lot of the digital protections that the Bureau has in place to protect the census responses, and then also what organizations that are looking to get out the count can kind of do to increase their their cybersecurity when they're helping folks to get out the count. So if we jump to the next slide. Yeah, so one of the ways I like to frame this conversation is that there's three levels of technology that we have to think about in 2020. And so one of them is the Census Bureau and what they're building out. The other is kind of when the rubber hits the road, right? And once the hiring portal is open and self-response will be open soon. And so what does that really mean when the rubber hits the road? So that's kind of the census stakeholder security, and then just this larger digital environment that we live in. And so I'll walk through all three of those a little bit. And a lot of the technical security from the Bureau kind of comes in two forms. So there's cybersecurity, and then there's mathematical security. And so again, it was touched on in the previous presentation, differential privacy and this mathematical technique to add just another layer of security on top of the other Title 13 and other things that are in place. So just as a brief overview, because I imagine folks are coming from all different areas of expertise. When I refer to cybersecurity, I'm thinking about what's protecting information and communication systems. So thinking things like your email and internet providers and anything that's providing a connection between devices and those devices themselves. So it includes hardware and software, and that entire like end-to-end communication and information system. So if we go to the next slide, please. The Census Bureau, they're doing a lot for 2020. They're digitizing a lot in 2020. So they're building out 52 information and communication systems for most of their operations. So again, this covers hiring, self-response, portal, what enumerators will have, they'll have devices out in the field. All of those operations are built out and being updated for 2020. So the security that they're providing for those, all of these systems include things like their office computers, the iPhones that enumerators will have, and things like that. So specific features, cybersecurity features on enumerator devices include two-factor authentication and remote wipe. So enumerators will be out in the field. They'll have their iPhone. They have to be able to there's a two-step process for them to log on. So whether that's a fingerprint and an ID code, or a passcode and face scan, or whatever it winds up being, there is a two-step process. So that makes the device very secure. And then they also have a remote wipe feature. So if for some reason the enumerator loses their device, all of the information can be wiped clean. And it's also worth noting, because I think the Bureau's gone back and forth over this past decade testing how they'll use it. Enumerators will have census specific devices. So they can, have their personal phone on them, but their personal phone will not be used to collect responses. So enumerators have Census Bureau issued, census only, specific iPhone with a whole host of security features on it to make sure that when they're out in the field, their things are as secure as they can possibly be. So there's that. The software features are, protected by malware, and then data is protected by a process called encryption. And so encryption means that your individual responses that you can read, normally for me, it's Maria Filippelli, I live in Washington, D.C., that gets translated to some sort of like alphanumeric, which would look, like I wouldn't be able to read it, right? It's translated into a different code. And that happens, or a different string of letters and numbers. And that happens twice in the process. So once, if you're on the self-response portal, or if you call in to take to give your responses to someone on the phone, or you're in the library, you're doing it, responding to the census that way. Once the submit button is hit, those responses are encrypted once as they go over the communication channel. So that's called encryption in transit. And then they're encrypted a second time when they hit the Census Bureau's database. So it's encrypted at rest. So there's two, it's a double set of encryptions, which makes it incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to kind of decrypt or read individual responses if something were to happen, right? So, and to know at the Census Bureau, there's only a handful of people that actually have the code to de-encrypt responses. So in that way, through the communication and collection of responses, the Bureau is really up to date and providing the best protections that they can. The Bureau is also working with big tech and private organizations to understand and implement best practices. So they are working with Google. I don't know, they've had conversations with Microsoft and Starbucks, and all of these sort of large, national or global organizations that have to deal with these huge issues of how to keep data and transactions secure every day. They have been consulting with them. So they're not really building this in a box, right? They talk to other partners to understand and have the state-of-the-art implementation of cybersecurity. What the Bureau won't do is release everything that they're doing. So they do release some things we know they're looking at, they're monitoring data flows, right? Because they're expecting a certain flow of information, but they weren't releasing the volume of traffic that they're expecting, or really a lot of detail about their security plan, because that in and of itself is a security risk. So for people like me who like to dig into it, it's kind of a double-edged sword. It's oh, okay, good. It's it is very secure, and you're doing as much as possible to keep responses protected, but me being working in this field, I like to dig into the weeds. So sometimes I find it frustrating that I don't know more than I do. But that being said, the Bureau is doing a lot. Another thing to keep in mind too is that the Bureau, they're consulting with outside firms, and they have a structure to build out the system that is required by any organization or any agency that's building out a federal system. So the National Institute of Standards and Technology has developed a framework that any federal agency or bureau that's building one of these systems has to adhere to. So that's guidelines for developing the system, for testing the system, for monitoring the system, for communicating issues. All of that is laid out for the Bureau, and so that's what they build against that framework. And that's also, if you've seen any of the reports from the GAO or any of the critiques of what's being built, that's where it's coming from. So the GAO knows this framework the Bureau is supposed to be building against, and if they're not meeting development or testing or monitoring guidelines, that's how the GAO knows to report where issues are. And so, but again, the GAO is privy to a lot of information that the general public isn't. So they can report things, and it's a little bit high level, but they're not going to release a lot of things in detail, because again, that in and of itself is a security risk. Okay, so next slide, please. So once the Census Bureau builds out all its systems and it's released to the public, and kind of where the rubber meets the road and is where our personal and organizational security and systems meet what the Bureau is building out. So as census stakeholders, we also have a role in keeping the census digitally secure. So all of these things that I'm going to talk about now will be in the Get Out the Count, or the GOTC toolkit, which is scheduled for release in mid-October. So the toolkit will have a lot of information about the census and getting out the count in general, and then there'll be a specific section on organizational cybersecurity. So the toolkit will have like a detailed narrative, some one-pagers that can be shared, little 1-minute videos that are kind of easy and can be shared widely about Wi-Fi and broadband access, devices, and browsers. So, for example, with Wi-Fi security, if you're an organization that's looking to set up a census kiosk or have a computer available at a community meeting or things like that to help collect responses, it's best to use a private Wi-Fi network that has a strong password attached to it. If you, and then when it comes to browsers, one of the easiest things, or one of sort of the best practices, is to understand the URL, right? So the census is a government organization. All of their materials and links and everything will have a .gov at the end, right? They'll never have a .com, they'll never have a .org. It's always .gov. So knowing that is always helpful in as a good cybersecurity tactic, as well as keeping browsers up to date. So I know I'm guilty of this sometimes too, right? You'll see a little note pop up like, hey, it's time to update your browser. And you're like, okay, pause. I'm in the middle of an email, like we'll do that in 10 minutes. And then sometimes you forget about it, but it's really important when you see those to keep the browser updated, because a lot of those updates include security patches and things like that. So they can just kind of help to continue to build your organizational and personal strong cybersecurity posture. And then the last thing on devices, very similar to browsers, keeping your operating systems up to date. Those often, again, I know they take a while, but they usually have a security patch, and they can help just, again, it's another layer of strong cybersecurity that will protect anybody that's using your device. And in an ideal scenario, if you are a group that's taking a device out to the public to kind of help collect responses, in an ideal scenario, it is something that's a dedicated device, right? So it's only for collecting census responses. It doesn't have email. It doesn't have any social media or any other system on there. So next slide, please. All right. And so now we have what the Bureau is doing, how we can help increase what the Bureau is doing when everything's released. And then now we have just sort of this larger digital environment that we live in. So the two big things I want to touch on with this digital environment are disinformation and differential privacy. So disinformation is, anticipated to be a threat to the census, right? We've all seen what the president tweets. We know it's not true. Like, we know that he's trying to decrease participation in the census, right? And we don't want that to happen. And so, that's one example. Unfortunately, I expect that to continue. But however, if there are other processes and things that are being put in place to help stop the spread of disinformation in general and from other nefarious actors. So one is that there's some platform commitments. So Facebook and Twitter and Google have all, I don't know how public they've all been about this, but they are all invested in stopping the spread of disinformation around the census and also around elections, right? Because we know those are two big things happening in 2020. The Census Bureau a couple days ago just released a new email and some information on their 2020 census.gov site. So they have an email, I think it's rumors@census.gov, but that's a public reporting tool specifically for instances of mis and disinformation. So, it kind of has a little bit of a different like response network from like a PIO or just sort of a general census email, right? That's going specifically to folks that are working on mis and disinfo to try to see, just collect what's out there and see if it's something that needs a response from the Bureau. So that's available for folks all over. And then there's going to be some more information, again, in the GOTC toolkit about what to do if you see how to identify disinformation, what you can do to kind of prevent disinformation, and then how to respond or report what you're seeing in the fields. And then switching from differential privacy or to differential privacy. So differential privacy is a mathematical or computational way to protect re-identification of responses. If folks are familiar of what was done in the past, the Census Bureau used to kind of swap around a few, similar households but different, and they did this swapping technique enough so that it was really difficult to re-identify like an entire block or tract or whatever. Given the advent of commercial data and how much that is bought and sold and how much we, produce data that's available online, that's not a technique that's no longer feasible. So the Bureau is going with this differential privacy technique. And so as mentioned earlier, kind of creates a little bit of noise in the data, which means that it's just, it's just a little bit fuzzier or like less potentially specific than it used to be. However, all of the sort of parameters and how that will roll out is not finalized yet. Thankfully, there's still time to provide some input into what the Bureau is doing. If you are super interested in that, this Thursday and Friday is the Census Bureau's Scientific Advisory Council meeting. And I think, if I remember the agenda correctly, Friday morning is when the Bureau will talk about data products and differential privacy. Because what differential privacy is going to do is it has an effect on the data products that have traditionally been available from the decennial. And so there'll be a conversation about what data products are available, what the Bureau is looking to do to kind of replace ones that they know are in high demand, but are kind of tricky to recreate with differential privacy. And so the Bureau will walk through that with the most up-to-date information that they have on Friday morning. And so those CSAC meetings you can just, watch them online or watch the video recording later if you're interested in that. So they are still looking to do some more outreach in that area. And then if we just go to the next slide, I just kind of put, some summary information on there and my contact information for folks. So that's all I had for now. Happy to take questions or,
Thank you, Julia and Maria. So we're going to get started with Q&A. To ask a question, you can either use the chat box or questions box to send your question, or you can raise your hand to have your line unmuted and ask the question yourself. And again, this webinar is recorded, and we'll send out the recording and the presentation out after the webinar. So we have a question from Rita on Title 13. Is it possible that the Trump administration could gain access to census data under the Patriot Act, or are there any loopholes to get around Title 13? And how can we ensure that undocumented folks will be protected under Title 13 when there have been stories about census data being used to harm populations such as Muslim Americans after 9/11? Julia, do you want to take that question?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. Okay, so first the question is like a two-parter. So first the question was whether the Trump administration could use something like the Patriot Act to circumvent existing Title 13 protections. So the answer is that it would be very difficult for them to do so. There are a couple of reasons. So the Patriot Act became law after the existing Title 13 protections were in place. And the Office of Legal Counsel in 2010, which sets out legal analyses for executive branch agencies, looked into the question of whether the Patriot Act could be read to override the pre-existing Title 13 protections. And the Office of Legal Counsel concluded that it did not. So this was a pretty long opinion that went through the language in both statutes and decided that Title 13 was stronger than the Patriot Act. That said, Office of Legal Counsel memoranda are, not the same as a court decision, right? So there's potentially a little bit of wiggle room if the current administration wanted to reverse position on that pre-existing memo. But because that memo already exists and there's all that legal analysis out in the world that says Title 13 is stronger than the Patriot Act, there'd be grounds for civil rights groups to then challenge any attempt to use the Patriot Act. So I can't say that it's impossible for the administration to use the Patriot Act, but it would not be easy. It's also worth noting that the Patriot Act is somewhat limited in application. So in addition to the existing finding that Title 13 supersedes the Patriot Act, it should be noted that the Patriot Act is limited to terrorism investigations. But even with that, we would not want to see census data ever released under purported terrorism investigation. And then I think the second part of the question was about the history of using data against certain communities. So you referred to post 9/11, and for folks who don't know, what happened after 9/11 is that there was a request by the Department of Homeland Security for a list of cities that contain large populations of Arab Americans with a zip code level breakdown of those populations by country of origin. So it wasn't releasing individuals' identities, but it was saying, okay, folks from these countries live in higher density at the following zip codes. And so something that's noteworthy about that is that that is a statistical data set that cannot be traced to an individual. So it doesn't actually conflict with Title 13's confidentiality protections. But in my presentation earlier, I had a section about the procedural protections that have been put in place for statistical data sets. So even if it's anonymized, which it must be, we do now have these requirements that any special requests like that get publicized. Those statistical requests cannot go against the purposes of the census. And for something like that, that's looking at a specific population, such as Arab Americans, that would be a sensitive topic that would require an additional level of review. So yes, it is possible for agencies to continue to seek data sets about certain populations, but we now have these sunshine provisions that make it easier for advocates to keep track of who's asking for what. So if we see something that raises a flag, like a request for the new Arab American zip code breakdown, we can seek additional information and try to step in as the civil rights community as needed.
Thanks, Julia. And that slide about the procedural protections is up as well.
Yeah.
We have a question from Leslie about the new system being used to sort data moving forward. How will this be different than the way data was collected and stored on American Fact Finder? Maria, do you want to take this question?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's a little TBD on that. So American Fact Finder uses ACS data, or it's majority ACS data, right? So the ACS data won't be touched by differential privacy until at least 2025. The Bureau came out with that maybe about a month or decision about a month or so ago. So American Fact Finder will remain the same for the time being. A lot of the census data is stored on the cloud. I think, you know, the Bureau's been doing that for several years. But that is something they have to work through, right? With the transition to differential privacy. And I think they have to get through this iteration of, or my sense is, right? I don't know this 100%, but my sense is they have to get through this iteration of what's going to happen with 2020 and what do the data products really look like to see what they need to update in American Fact Finder and some of those other tools that folks really rely on for their work.
Thank you. And another question for Maria. This is from Vanessa. What precautions are taken against highly trained hackers, including foreign government security breaks that threaten us?
Sure. So there's a couple things, right? One's what the Bureau's doing, and then one's like what we can do. The Bureau does a lot of threat modeling and like testing of their systems. So it's referred to as sometimes like white hat hacking, or like blue level testing. I mean, they're like red, white, and blue levels of testing. But anyway, or blue teams. And so what they do is they really try to like have folks who are skilled in hacking and who understand these systems, like try to break them. And they do this periodically, like as they're building things out. It's like, okay, you know, we're at a certain point, like let's bring in these skilled folks and really try to break it. And so that's one of the things that the Bureau's doing. In addition, right, to talking to the private sector and talking to other groups about what the best hacking preventions are. So that's that. For census stakeholders, right, I think there is still, understandably, right, some concern about what happened on the social media platforms in 2016, right? So a lot of that was foreign interference. And so for that, I would say, you know, as stakeholders, just to like when the GOTC toolkit comes out, or you know, potentially in an upcoming network to really, or upcoming webinar, to kind of think about what really try to know the best techniques to prevent against this hacking, right? So like, what is a sock puppet or a fake account? You know, how does that work and operate, and how does that look different from someone that, like, I know was a member of my group? And what do, you know, how do I report what I see when I know it's it is, you know, discriminatory or inaccurate information? Like, how do I flag that to social media partners? How do I, you know the right URLs, and how do I optimize my website to make sure that the good information is popping up, right? So when somebody types in you know, census or key terms in a search bar, the search engine requires them, the search engine requires that something be returned. And so the more accurate information about the census that's out there, and the more information that we can put out there, the harder it is to exploit those algorithms. So just knowing, like, on the stakeholder side, like, those are things that we can do. So the more we work to optimize search engines, the more we push out accurate information, you know, and sometimes you just kind of have to, you know, you don't necessarily want to promote some disinformation, right? So if it's just a small little bit of disinformation that one people post and there's nobody following them, like, it's not necessarily, you know, there's a decision point, like, that's not necessarily something you want to respond to. So anyway, I feel like I went off a little bit on a tangent, but there are, you know, the Bureau is doing what they can, and then we have our responsibility as stakeholders to do what we can.
Thanks, Maria. And a question from Koyuka. Could you repeat the websites you had mentioned earlier with information on disinformation?
Yeah, so 2020census.gov is like the 2020, it's the Census Bureau's like 2020 specific site, right? Because if you try to look for 2020 census information on just the regular Bureau site, it's like a bit of a nightmare. So they're making a more a more usable version of their information. So 2020census.gov will have information about like preventing frauds and scams, and that's where you'll see information about like what an enumerator will look like, right? They'll have a badge where you can report rumors at census.gov, and all that kind of stuff is on there.
Thanks. And a question from Melody. I work with older adults. Are there strategies planned to prevent scams and fraud, especially in light of the new collection processes?
Sure. So AARP is part of the Census Counts campaign, and they are planning a whole, or they're part of the network. They're planning a whole series of like posts and things about the census. So they, like through their website and their magazine, they're going to have a series of articles on like, what to expect and how to fill it out online and how to prevent frauds and scams and what, where you can report them to, because AARP has kind of their own fraud and scam reporting tool. So that's one way. I know they have a pretty long reach, but that's definitely one group that I know that's focused specifically on older adults.
Thanks, Maria. And a question for Julia. This is from Risa. Is there any news on how household counts will be shared with the public during the self-reporting phase and NRFI phase? Such information will help organizations do get out the count work and gauge their effectiveness in real time.
Yeah, that's a great question. So unfortunately, I haven't heard anything recently, but what the Census Bureau has said is that their Rome mapping program, which is currently used to determine where the HTC areas are, will be releasing information regarding response rates. The default level will be county, but I understand that the Bureau is looking at allowing people to see census tract level data. Unfortunately, I don't know the frequency with which that will be updated, and I know that's an important issue for making sure it's useful and real time. Yeah, I think that's it. Oh, one other thing is folks have asked whether you can see specific households, and that type of detail will not be released for privacy and confidentiality reasons.
Thanks, Julia. And we have one last question from Suzanne. What can we do as organizations to raise awareness and ensure people that their census data are protected? Do you have resources we can refer people to? So this is Bessie. I can plug that we do have a fact sheet available on countissin2020.org, and it's focused on census data and confidentiality. So that's currently available in English. We'll also have it translated into 15 Asian languages, and those translations will be available later this month. And Julia and Maria, is there anything you'd like to add in terms of resources?
I would just say, in addition, censuscounts.org has some of that. I mean, we do post all of AAJC's fact sheets and stuff, but knowing like the GOTC toolkit will be out in like 4 to 6 weeks, that's just another resource.
And this is Julia. I'll just additionally plug the value of hopefully folks have resources and volunteers for this, but the value of in-person conversations and meeting people where they are. Written materials are really helpful, but for some community members, having those in-person contacts will make all the difference to ensuring participation.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie and Maria, for joining us today. Again, this webinar is recorded and we'll send out a copy of the recording and presentation to everyone following this webinar. As a plug for future webinars, we have new webinars coming every month. The next ones will focus on engaging college students and Get Out the Count, and also engaging K through 12 and teachers and Get Out the Count. And all of our past webinars can be found on countusin2020.org. And lastly, here is the contact information for our speakers today. Julia with Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Asian Law Caucus, and Maria with New America. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and we look forward to being in touch again soon.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, everyone.